Hello again, friends. It's me, Rob Womack. I'm the author of this little book, Jubilee, the Emancipation of Life and Love, and I'm here today to read you another chapter from the book. It's just a nice enough day outside that the windows are open, so you may have some background noise from the birds, bluebirds and cardinals and wrens, or from my two cats, Ida B and Sojourner, who were fascinated by the birds. But I don't think that they'll disturb us. The chapter that I'm going to read today opens with an epigraph from Laura Basso Walls. Her book is Henry David Thoreau, A Life, and this quote comes from pages 271 and 272. In a stroke, Thoreau swept the modern world away for a new world infinitely deeper and wider. I know of no book that has so few readers. There is none so truly strange and heretical and unpopular. Seek first the kingdom of heaven. Lay not up for yourself treasures on earth. Think of this, Yankees, he mocks. Let but one of these sentences be rightly read from any pulpit in the land, and there would not be left one stone of that meeting house upon another. Genius, to be heard, must not outrun its audience. But Thoreau had left his audience far behind. Yet his fundamental insight never wavered. Your scheme must be the framework of the universe. All other schemes will soon be in ruins. Chapter 4. Creators of Myths. We are late into the 11th hour, the last of the 99th increment of time. The path before us is crooked and rough. Hold fast to hope. Please, do not be afraid. Once our destination is within sight, the uneven ground will be leveled like a plain. Life and love patiently, persistently illuminates the way. Landmarks appear more familiar, yet home is still far from sight. 3 days ago, in the fractional units used thus far, our oldest parent, Erectus, domesticated fire. On this, the third day hence, our youngest parent, Sapiens, honor their origins through rituals for the deceased. Not long thereafter, less than 3 hours ago, Sapiens' last relative, Neanderthalensis, was lowered in the grave. 2 hours on, and the 11th hour dawned. Within 15 minutes of its commencement, Sapiens had learned to domesticate the sun. Seeds were planted, sprouts nurtured. Sapiens and neighbors were all well fed. Right away, Sapiens began to specialize and divide their labor. Agriculture and new systems of work freed time for the burgeoning populations. In the expanding space between work and rest, play cultivated imagination. Creativity was enhanced. Likewise, abstract thought and innovation. One innovation was the concept of money, a simple coin to hold a place in time for the exchange of needs and to convey gratitude for their provision. Money began to circulate at the bottom of this, the 11th hour. 10 minutes later, now 40 into the hour, and Sapiens coined yet another innovation. Old Neanderthalensis' drawings were refined into symbols, later called letters, to represent the previous symbols of vocalized sounds. Letters were assembled into words, approximations of translations 2 degrees removed from one reality. Sapiens eagerly coupled words into sentences, like train cars of teacups too small for their freight. The words runneth over with power and meaning. Only the irony was retained. Captions of words were appended to young Sapiens' drawings. As they aged, the captions lengthened. Grammar synthesized. Images waned. Abstract stories emerged. Oral stories once told by the ancestors were frozen, perfected, confused, and forgotten. Symbols called numbers like letters were drafted. Abstract concepts to quantify objects, money, time, and space. A form of grammar called math was invented to represent, measure, and divide. Trade was tabulated, gardens evenly sectioned, maps imposed unsightly boundaries upon the land. Structures rose higher, bridges arched and lengthened, days were divided, calendars synchronized. In 8 minutes more, 3/4 through the 11th hour, an oral story was preserved in symbols of written words. Creation myths were transcribed. Myths born of limited witness reduced a complex world into hard documents. They formulated sapiens' subjective interpretations to alleviate a modicum of confusion between prediction, preference, and surprise. In times past, sapiens' humble understanding was derived solely from experience. Upon the mental maps, a hedge was penciled in. On one side, wisdom. On the other, mystery. Sapiens maintained comfort with ambiguity and uncertainty. With the advent of a vibrant imagination, however, brought on by agriculture, divisions of labor, and extended play, sapiens began to speculate about mystery with abstract stories crafted in the mind. Somewhere along the way, they leapt over mystery's hedge. On one side remained the infinite intricacy of a unified reality, but now on the other was what some preferred to be true instead. In millions of ways minuscule and stressful in the immediacy, as well as a handful chronically destructive, sapiens' offspring attempted to define a false reality. Then they attempted to enact the stories crafted by the imagination. Many believed so fervently the stories seemed factual. Most concerning of all, they lost the ability to distinguish the difference. The myths were noble attempts to make sense of a novel situation. A mere 17 minutes ago, 4 millennia in Earth years, sapiens' offspring suddenly found their lives had been upended. Some neighbors had devised selfish manipulations of the rules of money, work, and authority. Voluminous power was accumulated, often violently, by a small number of sapiens. Lesser degrees, labeled privileges, were widely distributed to broad complicity. To mold the bricks and erect the pyramids, Pharaoh and his minions set forth to control the people. As a result, 2 new concepts were coined to represent motivations and experiences. The first was evil, the second, suffering. 2 notions never before conceived in the entirety of the universe. From these 2, many more would spill forth, such as enslavement and exploitation. First came Pharaoh, then the Babylonians. Then the Romans occupied the seat at the head of the table, the first of a long dynasty of Euro-Americans. Though the site of centralized power may drift, the suffering of inequality holds firm. Sapiens' offspring throughout the kingdom were locked in states of opposition. Many struggled to escape. Some made it out alive. Most preferred to submit and play their part. With rewards and penalties so great, decisions to submit were easily made. Privilege and power, rewards and penalties do corrupt, often surreptitiously. Under the proper conditions, as Pharaoh well knew, like fire and plants, sapiens could be domesticated too. The people enslaved, however, were imbued with an innate sense of freedom. Pharaoh never could cleanse them of this spiritual, energetic sense. Try as he might, of hope and freedom, sapiens could never be dispossessed. Based on prevailing norms and conditions, however, Options for escape seemed few and far between. For those distorted and corrupted by power, privilege, and wealth, exercising the freedom to choose equality was like a sacrifice of one's firstborn. The bait had been eaten. The hook was set. Fortunately, for those willing to harness the courage and put forth the effort, life and love stood ready, with arms wide open, blindfolded, unconditionally awaiting their embrace. Following the advent of evil and suffering, of inequality, power, and wealth, a new tool was needed to bind together interdependent beings heaving against the strain. Listeners of a sacred melody, quietly humming through the universe, attempted to represent the instructions emanating from a tiny mustard seed. The universal ethic of care was reduced to words as a reminder of their origins, relationships, and equality. The weaving of the new binding began unceremoniously. No money or materials were available. Tools which threatened Pharaoh were scarce. With the aperture of heart and mind opened wide, silent meditations and patient observations were sufficient to initiate the process. Later, there would be the gatherings, free exchanges of literacy and ideas, and ultimately incessant demonstrations of care and reciprocity, a revelation, a reweaving of the web of life and love. Another day of labor on Pharaoh's pyramid was complete. Weary sapiens gathered by the fire to rest and contemplate. Questions were openly asked. Teachers recalled the days of their youth when similar questions had been pondered. Yet the freedom, the hope to speak them aloud had long been put asunder. Questioners sensed something or someone mysterious hovered around or within. There seemed to be something somewhere out there in here much larger than themselves. Whatever, whoever it was, it is, I am. It exists. A felt sense of first-hand experience confirmed within Sapiens' belly, heart, and mind. Curiosity, compassion, and courage stirred an irrepressible drive. Questions were raised in hopes of deeper understanding. From where did we come? Why are we here? Where does the spirit go, if it goes elsewhere? Answers were elusive. Possibly they preceded memory, language, and abstract thought. To reduce potential responses into symbolic words seemed a daunting task. Nonetheless, with great humility, a valiant effort was put forth. Sapiens entrusted intuition emanating from the original source. It too had been woven of the same threads as the tapestry of the universe. The question of why are we here, oriented as it is towards the perpetual present, provided a natural starting point. Answers to questions of where sapiens came from and where they were going were inextricably bound into why we are here. We were born to peacefully care for our elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin, to give to the best of our ability, to receive only as we need, to learn, adapt, and teach before the baton is passed through our death, so life and love goes on for perpetuity. Anything more was commentary, anything less simply incomplete. To accommodate the intensifying pace of work under Pharaoh's enslavement and the diminishing spans of attention, stories told around the fire began with an opening act and sapiens situated front and center. For similar reasons, the stories concluded in grand extravagance. The protagonists, all played by sapiens of course, were the incarnate cosmic hero and the imperiled subjects cowering in distress. Such notions of the beginning and end were contrived to frame the narrative limits of attention and comprehension. They are intellectual prostheses to sum up human experience. With apparently nothing more meaningful before, during, or after, as the story was told, Sapiens' offspring came to hail themselves as the one and only actor of any importance. As the stories propagated, elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin were relegated further and further into supporting roles, an allegorical cast of scapegoats, metaphors, and foils. To keep attention where it thinks it belongs, flattened characters were an accommodation to Sapiens' learned self-centeredness. It was for this reason that translations of the universal ethic of care, later called religious thought, spun so far out of control. With Sapiens firmly established as the center of attention, the director, with a capital D, hovered off stage just behind the curtains. He played his part to pull the strings and work the lights. All the while the adoring director preened for the lead. From backstage he impatiently waited while his love went unrequited. The director was intimately aware of all things Sapiens, their mannerisms, their foibles, their health. Not a hair on the head went uncounted. In fact, he may have been more than a little obsessed. In the entire realm of the history of the universe, nothing distracted the director from Sapiens and their behavior. With the characters stationed in their rightful places and the drama well underway, the story proceeded naturally towards an apocalyptic end. Another time for tea. Sapiens, as the story was told, had been created slightly lower than the angels, and, by implication, over and above everyone else. In one-on-one comparisons with all expressions of life and love across the entire history of the entire universe, some offspring held themselves as the most advanced. In its creativity, the human imagination is absolutely unsurpassed. It can be the most easily persuaded and, curiously, the most difficult to correct. Sapiens' offspring became so numerous and so steeped in the inequality of privileges and suffering, disagreements were rampant. On the status of their superiority, however, nearly everyone agreed. Fortunately, a steadfast remnant held out hope. Hope, like freedom, had a foothold and never would release. If, in fact, the offspring of Sapiens had been among the beings most advanced, they would also have been the safest, healthiest, and most content. Yet if one gazes across the landscape of these last minutes of the 11th hour, their lived experience seems far from such for one so intelligent. Distrust and dissatisfaction are as rampant as the disagreements. Likewise, anger and fear. Neighbors face violent danger that in any other time or place would be impossible to comprehend. The happiest demonstrated version of a game children once called pretend. On the newly named planet called Earth, something seems to have gone terribly awry. Perplexed yet hopeful elders, teachers, and children began to ask themselves, how did we get here? From where did we diverge? More importantly, what will happen next? In light of the troubles, to address the perennial questions, allow the aperture to narrow for a moment of closer inspection. A minority among them have occupied a supermajority of positions of authority at most levels of organized society. Strangely enough, this minority all share three traits in common. The correlations cannot be easily dismissed. The minority were grouped and divided as able-bodied, heterosexual, and male. It is safe to assume most of this minority tried their level best. Unfortunately for everyone, including the minority, a corruption spread through the inherited scripts. Equally unfortunate, due to their overbearing dominance, generation after generation, very few points of comparison exist. Would other leaders with other scripts have yielded other results? For the better, or, heaven forbid, for worse? Now, allow attention to focus even more closely. A subset of the minority grew to maturity upon one of the 7 continents. They lauded themselves as the most deserving, those upon whom all focus should rightly attend. By their own proud admission, among all others, they were the most exceptional, the most dominant. In the colonization of lands, bodies, cultures, and beliefs, particularly in the areas of religion, science, economics, and language, they were unsurpassed. As a group, none to date, not even Pharaoh, had been able to export their unwelcome violence and greed upon other parts of the planet, like the men of European descent. This subset of the offspring were so distinguished, they acquired a unique identity all to themselves. They became known as Euro-Americans, a term to concisely identify where they matured and how far they strayed. As the aperture reopens, let it not be said that other members from other continents are therefore innocent, that is, those who managed to survive or were left untouched by Euro-American migrations and colonization. They may have troubles of their own with the distortions of gender, caste, privilege, power, and violence. But Western civilization, to use a term liberally, widely disseminates a self-aggrandizing history of the victorious, likely better known by you, the reader, and your guide, who is more prophet than historian at that. From here on out, our attention focuses on the Euro-Americans. Less than 7 minutes ago, in the fractional units of the universe, the universal ethic of care was co-opted for ill intent. The edifice was preserved, the cornerstone rejected. A method to bind us together, later called religion, was used instead to divide and to twist. The Word, capital W, as written, so they said, was inspired by a divine hand. It was perfect, inerrant, and interpretable only by men, those ordained by a higher power, that is. Anyone who questioned their authority or their infallible interpretations was at first smugly ignored. If dissent persisted, the rhetoric heated up. Dissenters were disobedient, sinful, heretics, enemies of the state. The most incorrigible were condemned to die, to be mutilated, burned, hanged, or crucified. In the beginning, as the story was told, a new word, human, was defined. Instantly, humans were granted dominion to name and to rule. They claimed power, a concept previously unheard of, over every living being. Humans seized rights to colonize everything and everyone, despite the fact that no one else understood a word they said. From that day forward, sapiens were no longer to consider themselves as equals with elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin. They were no longer at one with the web. The notion of power infiltrated their spirits and minds. It knew no limits. It knew no ends. Even the ineffable was ascribed a name, a gender, and a place, just off stage and far overhead. The first division was rendered complete, and it was deemed good. In the second act of creation, the religious interpreters divided the humans on the basis of anatomy. Those with facial hair and penises were called men, those without, women. half went one way, half the other. Their rightful places clearly designated, the roles, behavior, and attitudes were easier to define. To the right, masculine; to the left, feminine. According to the infallible interpreters, distinctions were to be strictly kept. Deviations were an abominable sin, a novel concept without precedent. The freedom to be became unforgivable. With verdicts prejudged, a minimum sentence was declared. Inescapable torment in a fiery abyss for eternity. Before the sun had set, the horizontal separation of men and women side by side stood on end. Men were above, women below. Men were associated with the head and shoulders, the source of all rationality, strength, and power. Women were associated with the heart and womb, deep wells of erotic desire and emotional instability. In the authoritative view of a particular minority, women were best seen, looked at, touched, and unheard. On occasion, the imposed silence escaped its container. Resistance was expressed. Once put back in their place, however, women dutifully followed the commands of the rational head, raised the children into obedient workers, stoic warriors, selfless nursemaids, and humble slaves. Then tend to the home, the gardens, the aging parents, and, last but certainly not least, service their leader, provider, and spouse, or any man who so desired. Boys, on the other hand, were taught the ways of masculinity, strength, hard work, haughty inaction, and utter disregard. Anger, lust, and pride were permitted, respected, even encouraged. Sadness, regret, fear, and remorse were strictly forbidden. With no healthy practices of self-restraint, by early adulthood their violence, selfishness, and unapologetic greed overwhelmed the men and their neighbors equally. By the age of full maturity, men were successively sequestered into bifurcated states of stoicism and rage. The insidiousness of unchecked authority severely impaired their abilities for reciprocity, fidelity, and selfless care. Handcuffed by power, privileges, and the fear of losing both, their loneliness and isolation could never be admitted. The second division was thus complete, and it too was deemed good. In the third act of creation, the Euro-American men noticed that not all humans fell in love in the same way. Some exercised the freedom to love those with bodies much like their own. They bonded naturally and cared for each other, often for life, with less emphasis on making babies or the religiously defined roles. It was as if some believed there was more to life and love than disseminating sperm and dominating a mate. Such relationships the Euro-American heterosexual male simply could not tolerate. If humans were allowed a wide range of options and the freedom to choose, hierarchies once erected go limp. Homosexuality was thus forbidden, a sin never to be transgressed. Sex and sexuality were made taboo, never to be discussed, neither in the public sphere nor in the privacy of one's home. Taboos proved effective at stoking the ire of the hateful and stifling the shamed. Thenceforth, men were commanded to marry only women, to wed with them for life. Such arrangements mitigated their stunted abilities to care for self, family, and neighbor. In addition, with one woman always at their disposal, the obsessive pursuit for sex may be alleviated, or at least moderated, to a degree. On second thought, the command may have functioned in the reverse. Women may have been told to stand by their man for life. Regardless of the terror experienced, Leaving was strictly forbidden. Divorce led to torment for eternity. In this world, however, transgressions were to be forgiven unconditionally, even if exceeding 7 times 70. With the freedom of movement thoroughly constrained, disparities were firmly entrenched. The third division was complete, and it too was deemed good. In the fourth act, the Euro-American men basked in the sun alone upon the shore. Across the Mediterranean Sea they stared. Strangers, neighbors unfamiliar, were rowing towards the beach. Their skin was as dark as night. The Euro-Americans, startled with fright, and said, "Quickly, from them we must separate. Create a new division, ex nihilo. Let us call it race." They opened their Bibles immediately to Genesis chapter 9, and in the pristine margins scribbled the curse of Ham. From that day forward, the Euro-American men thought of themselves as white, their neighbors from the south, black. In their self-imposed fear and ignorance, the dark-skinned neighbors were described as aggressive, lazy heathens. The Euro-American men thus established themselves as the standard-bearers for all which was civilized, superior, and good. Based on the inflated self-image, Euro-Americans were to be associated with the symbols of white and light. Others would perceive them as worthy and pure. All things dirty and evil, therefore, were associated with symbols black and dark. In hindsight, the choices were quite astonishing. The Bible they worshipped and adored often associated whiteness with lying and disease. Darkness was the source from which the divine light proceeds. Despite the incongruity, the fourth division was complete, and like those before, deemed good. As the sun rose on the fifth act of the Euro-Americans' creation, men debated the question, who is my neighbor? And thus, by inference, who was not? Faithful listeners scurried to define a new concept, citizens. Inside a government office, neighbors were separated and ranked by the proximity of their birth. If one was born nearby, north of the sea, and therefore white like us, they were named citizens. Such well-defined neighbors were to be supported, cared for, and loved. Those born further away and different in appearance were dubbed foreigners and often enemies. Citizens were permitted to shun, exploit, brutalize, or kill, but rarely to love the dark-skinned foreigner, one of the many privileges of citizenship. Privileges of citizenship were later renamed rights. With a subtle rebranding, bearers of privileges could have the best of both worlds. Rights were universal. All humans qualified. To the subhuman, rights were cleverly denied. In this way, the privileged beneficiaries of inequality preserved a feeling that they were inclusive, equal, and simultaneously a cut above. Euro-Americans were tacitly reminded, lest they lose sight of the reason why they, unlike others, were nominally free. They were the good guys. The implicit message was clearly received. This is a quote. "Stay obedient, please. Otherwise, you too might lose your rights and privileges." Close quote. With the newly established designation, other concepts emerged. Places were known as here and there. One was in, the other out. Neighbors like us belonged inside. Foreigners were kept out. Dark-skinned neighbors born further away yet still free to move about might occasionally sneak in. They found work, built homes, planted gardens, and sent their children to schools. At times, the dark-skinned sons flirted with the light-skinned daughters. Such behavior unnerved the citizens terribly. If foreigners stayed much longer, they might come to think of themselves as equals. They would want to wed. Then there would be the children. If roots were established, Euro-American heritage and inheritance would be threatened, their exceptionalism obscured. At first, the Euro-Americans politely encouraged the dark-skinned foreigners to leave voluntarily. A nudge of the elbow, a tilt of the head, a wink of the eye, all directed southward. If the first request was not understood, unwanted neighbors were told, in no uncertain terms, the time had finally come. Go back to where you were born. If the warnings were ignored, foreigners could be forcibly removed, exiled, and deported. Once again, quite surprising, since the Bible, ostensibly worshipped by the Euro-Americans, explicitly reminded them to be hospitable, for they too had once been strangers in the land. Furthermore, strangers who worshipped different gods, as well as neighbors who worshipped the same God in different ways, were punished similarly. If eviction to a distant land was prohibitively inconvenient, such strangers could be publicly lynched. In God's name, of course. The public hangings, the charred remains clearly warned the witnesses. Convert to the ways of the Euro-American. Be like us, not them. Spare yourself the test. To the third and fourth generations, the memories enmeshed. The fifth act seemed good indeed, or so thought the Euro-Americans. As communities grew more homogeneous, those isolated inside felt segregated, parentheses, or rather disintegrated, two linguistic symbols for one reality, close parentheses. Detached from information and experience, false assumptions arose. Strangers were believed to be uncontrollable, unmanageable, and uncivilized. Differences and diversity elevated the fear and threatened the ignorance of the Euro-Americans. Campaigns for purity and the cleansing of ethnicity were so successful, Euro-Americans became morose. It seemed as if everyone were once again equal. No one felt special in the unfair competition of us versus them, with no them beneath their blood-stained feet. For the penultimate act of creation, a less gruesome method was contrived to separate Euro-Americans from unwanted neighbors inside. A new concept, crime, gave rise to a new status, criminals. Crimes allowed trade and population to be regulated with less finality. When times were tight financially, unwanted neighbors born nearby and the foreigners allowed in could be kept and punished alive. Catching criminals also gave Euro-Americans a new sport to relieve their anxious minds. If a criminal ran away or approached too quickly or remained still when told to move or stood too aggressively or spoke when told not to, against them lethal force could be used. Neighbors became target practice, made live. Those fortunate enough to survive the arrest were imprisoned until times turned more prosperous. Such separations were meant to be only temporary, of course. Prisoners were to submit and conform to the hierarchy of Euro-American masculine ways. Imprisonment in crowded cells or solitary confinement were meant as mild forms of correction. Anything short of death to coerce a change in behavior. State-sponsored execution was reserved only for the most incorrigible. With criminals silenced and hidden away in plain sight, the ashamed and hushed tones could smugly say, "You see, we are not like them," and feel better about themselves. The methods of mild correction were also enacted far beyond the prison walls. Women and children in the home, like criminals behind bars and foreigners in the field, took the brunt of Euro-American masculine violence. Insatiable Euro-Americans built great ships to export their hierarchy-created violence to far and distant shores. The pioneers landed with great ferocity. Later waves rolled in with more sophisticated means to impose inequality and suffering. The Euro-American men were down to their final act. No rest would they permit. Endeavors were short of perfection, and time was running out. They had one last twist to foist upon their neighbors. If effective, it would endure for generations. In spite of the hierarchy, the creators of myths could easily foresee. So strong was the natural propensity for cooperation. A group of humans of differing genders, races, religions, and places of birth, yet of one heart and mind, might still come together to care for each other and flourish universally. This they could not tolerate. Something must be done. Their creation must never grow limp or die. Therefore, a new interpretation was inscribed into the Euro-American religious narrative to be exported and imposed as far as they may roam. No longer would Jubilee be an event collectively experienced by everyone. No longer would their futures be bound together in peace for eternity. The people of the land must utterly forget the meaning of shalom. Something called salvation, from here on out, would be doled out individually. Prior to the days of Pharaoh and the inequality of superiority and suffering, salvation as a concept was completely unheard of. Prior to the abuse and neglect of the poor, widows, orphans, and strangers, the Bible itself was unnecessary. The universal ethic of care had no need to be transcribed. It was embedded in the processes of life and love, as instructions of matter and energy, as seeds within a seed. Thus, the jilted offstage director was cast for a new role. In the midst of insufferable inequality, he would now play the part of judge, savior, and redeemer. In the early stages, the character was jealous, vengeful, and mercurial. Miracles and punishments alike seemed capricious and inexplicable. In the second half, the role transfigured. A divine and gentle shepherd patiently pursued his lost and broken sheep. Then, with mild persuasions, he tried to coax them back to follow in obedience. As time progressed, salvation would be described with innumerable written and spoken words. It was to be a discretionary gift, offered individually, after death, in spite of the human's innate, inherited, inescapable sin. Grace, unmerited love, forever undeserved, would be universally available for those who commit without question and willingly abide by the terms. The Savior offered individual believers a bargain difficult to reject. With an outstretched arm, he pointed the way to a promise of life beyond death. At the very next stop, paradise awaits. To achieve everlasting victory, the elect need only choose obedience to the all-male leaders, the powers and principalities, religious, commercial, and legislative, to their interpretations as well as their commands. The alternative, you ask? The fiery pits of hell for eternity. Methinks I heard the devil proclaim, there was no coercion, no collusion, none whatsoever, I say. Throughout the interregnum, the living struggled daily. While less fortunate neighbors suffered, those of better fortunes supped their cold comfort like a delicacy. Little did anyone know, the trials and tribulations had only just begun. The creation of the social hierarchy was complete, but up ahead was no Sabbath nor perfect paradise. A serpent lay in wait, named Economicus. And so ends chapter 4. Thank you for being here. We'll go to the next chapter right after this.